the Conservatives at some junctures all seem to be more like reactionaries, like they're manning the barricades. I know that talking to a lot of young people on the right today, one of the reasons they're fed up with the Conservatives is they think, there's just nothing worth conserving anymore. Everything is being burnt to the ground, and we've got to try and we're engaged first and foremost in a process of restoration. And that is to say, sometimes, the status quo is the opposite of what we want to conserve. The question is, why were those laws in place? Why is legitimate protest
that's a good question to ask.
And silent thought a criminal offense?
That's a very good question to ask. And still, JD Vance misrepresented what actually happened at this abortion clinic.
Listen.
Hello and welcome to Tell Me More, the English-speaking talk of Germany's Die ZEIT. And today we are speaking with Dr. James Orr, who is a professor of the philosophy of religion at Cambridge University. Dr. Orr, thank you so much for welcoming us at your home here in Cambridge.
It's great to be with you.
Thank you. Dr. Orr, I wanted to speak with you for several reasons. First of all, you have an interesting biography, but you are also friends with JD Vance, and you've even been described by Politico as his philosopher king, or the Vance whisperer here in Britain. Now this is interesting, of course. And you are heading what you call the national conservative movement in Britain. So we want to talk about all of this, your soulmateship with JD Vance, what you make of conservatism these days, how you imagine it. But before we dive into all of this, Dr. Orr, first tell us a bit about yourself. How did you arrive at where you are personally and politically?
Well, I grew up in Belgium, just outside Brussels, near Leuven, and had a very happy childhood, being exposed to the wonders of European culture. I got to speak French almost as soon as I started to learn English. I then went over to boarding school in England and then off to university, where I studied classics and fell in love with the world of classics. Went into the law. I was in corporate law for a few years at Freshfields, Bruckhaus Deringer, a fine Anglo-German law firm, and spent some happy years there, and then decided that really it was the life of the mind that I wanted to pursue. So I left law, came up here to Cambridge, and started my studies in theology, then in philosophy, and then I moved into ethics, public policy and politics. I spent a few years over in Oxford, then came back here in around about 2018, 2019, and I've been here ever since. So that's the day job. That's really my first love is research and teaching all these wonderful students who come through Cambridge every year. As you study philosophy, as you learn and read more about philosophy, particularly in my case, I read a lot of philosophy that is, let's say, long upstream of the Enlightenment. I love to read Plato and Aristotle. I teach Augustine and Aquinas, and so those are sort of it's a very traditional way of thinking about the moral universe, thinking about the nature of ultimate reality, and one that is probably, cuts against the grain of a lot of more secular, sort of liberal ways of understanding the moral universe. And I suppose it's that friction that has pushed me more into, slightly reluctantly, has pushed me more into the political arena.
All right. And how did you get to know JD Vance then? Can you explain the history of your relationship?
Well, we've moved in quite similar circles. We have I have a lot of friends in America. We have quite a few mutual friends. We're both very interested in religion, and when I got to know him, he was I think he had just converted to Catholicism, and we talked a lot about that.
It was in 2019?
This is around about 2019, that's right, 2019. But I was aware of him before. I remember in 2016, a Texan friend of mine, about two weeks before Trump's first win in November 2016, pressing Hillbilly Elegy into my hands and saying, Trump is going to win, and this is why. And I remember thinking, this guy's crazy. Of course Trump's not going to win, but this looks like an interesting book, and I'm going to read it.
Right. Let's just pause on this for a moment. We're talking about JD Vance's memoir, The Hillbilly Elegy.
That's right.
In which he highlighted his own growing up in Virginia, in the white working class, that felt very left behind and very underdogish in the United States. So how do you think, how does this, to this day, inform his political thinking?
Oh, enormously. I think it's impossible to take away his life experience from his political outlook. I think the impact of hillbilly elegy was very significant. I think in 2016, 2017, 2018, long before he was in Trump world, he was still he was recognized as somehow offering this kind of cri de coeur from the sort of forgotten flyover states, the sense of the economically and socially marginalized parts of America that had been, in his view, alienated by the coastal elites. And yet I think, you know, the vice president's great strength is that he understands that part of America, but he's also very much a product of the elites. He was a successful career in the military, Yale Law School, and he's worked in Silicon Valley, and so he's able to, you know, interpret those parts of those forgotten parts of America to the coastal elites. You know, he speaks fluent elitese, you might say, and I think that's what makes him such an interesting politician. That he's able to really, you know, grasp these two sides of America, which, as the writer Charles Murray once described in the title of his 2010 book, were coming apart. These two parts of America were coming apart, and somehow, you know, Trump was also in some strange way able to bridge those two divides. You know, he was this, you know, a businessman. He was very much a product of the kind of Manhattan real estate elites of the 1980s, and yet because he'd been on building sites from his teenage years, he was used to, you know, he never dropped his Queen's accent. He was perfectly comfortable with builders and with foremen and so on and so forth. And so I think both of them have got this ability, I think maybe Vance even more than Trump, to sort of shuttle between these two sides of America that are increasingly engaged in a dialogue of the deaf.
Right. I mean, we saw this in Britain too, of course, to a certain extent, society coming apart over the Brexit vote. And so what would you say, what aligns you and JD Vance? What makes you political soulmates? Was that also part of your life journey in a way, having been through the Brexit intellectual civil war here?
Well, I just wanted to pick up on something you said, that sort of Brexit sort of catalyzed this split, this coming apart. It didn't. I think it revealed the fact that Britain had begun to come apart quite a long time before 2016. And I think the same was true of the Trump phenomenon in 2016. You know, you know, one way of thinking about it is the influential framing is that of the great sort of English sociologist David Goodhart. He talks about, in his famous 2017 book, it's called The Road to Somewhere. And in that book, he describes this sort of spectrum between, you've got the global villagers on one end of the spectrum who have, you know, travel, who are, you know, moneyed, middle class, used to sort of going through airports, traveling around the world, enjoying the great benefits of world liberalism, global liberalism. And then at the other end of the spectrum, the 60% of Brits who live 20 miles from where they lived when they were 14. That's an extraordinary, you know, those are the somewheres, as it were, the people who are rooted to place, rooted to home, very rarely leave the country, won't go down to London very often. And so this is the sort of divide that was laid bare in Brexit, and laid bare, I think, with mutatis mutandis in the American context in 2016. Speaking for myself, I mean, I'm, as we say in English, a kind of a fish out of water. You know, as I said, I grew up in Brussels, and I have seen the failings of the European Union up close, and I've been a Eurosceptic Brexiteer since I was 13. Not because I don't like Europe, but because I love Europe. You know, the reason I hate FIFA is because I love football. And the reason I don't like the European Union is because I love Europe. And I remember, you know, before 1992, before Maastricht, there was a sense that Europe had achieved that equilibrium of being a family of nations, where the distinctiveness of each nation was celebrated and respected. I remember this particularly in my earliest political memory was probably November 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I remember the great sort of joy and celebration around that time, and a sense that, you know, Europe was back, and that we didn't need this sort of federal superstate in Brussels, undermining democratic accountability and homogenizing and so on. So that was my own background, and but it was a lonely position to be in. I was in Oxford at the time. I'm not sure there was anyone else in my college in Oxford who was voting for Brexit, but among the staff, the gardeners, the groundsmen, the waiters, the butlers, the porters, I couldn't find a single person who wasn't voting for Brexit.
Right.
And so I saw this cleft, this divide, right within this institution between, as it were, the somewheres and the anywheres.
Right. So would you say what we are seeing at the moment is actually the somewheres taking control, where the anywheres used to be in control? I mean, as we are talking, the Reform Party of Nigel Farage, Mr. Brexit, is topping the polls in Britain. He is at 29%, topping all other parties here. We see that the AfD in Germany is very much on the rise. You call yourself a national conservative. So would you say that this is what connects you and JD Vance, that you want the people who feel left behind by the, let's say, cosmopolitan elite of the past, you want them to have a new representation in politics, or what is this all about?
Yes, I mean, so I take the view that national preference should be the organising horizon of any government. I think the first loyalties and the first obligations of any elected representatives should not be to democratically unaccountable supranational entities, though they may have their role, they may have their importance, but that shouldn't be the primary obligation. The primary obligation is to the people, not just the people who elected you, but the people who didn't vote for you as well. And that is to say, for the national interest. And that seems to me wholly uncontroversial. It seems puzzling to me that there are parties that are simply focused on the national interest. The way that expresses itself might be in terms of left-wing policy, it might be in terms of right-wing policy, but that seems to me, a pretty basic political impulse that we have a nation. For now, that seems to be, since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, the nation state seems to be pretty much the natural default structure of any political community. Sometimes you'll have city-states, sometimes you'll have very successful empires, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for example. But the political community is first and foremost what must be preserved and conserved. And this is not controversial. This is effectively what Aristotle argues in his Politics. In Book 1, he says this is the polis is the community, is the community that must be preserved and conserved.
Are we really talking about preservation here and conservatism, or do you actually want to resurrect the national states? Because, I mean, you just said what happened in the past 20, 30 years.
Yes.
Internationalism, international organizations, institutions have taken over sovereign rights from democracy, which in itself was a democratic act, one could argue. But setting this aside for a moment, conservatism means to preserve things. What you appear to want, and I guess JD Vance as well, is a bit more than that. You want to go back to where the nations were 20, 30 years ago. So this contains an element of disruption, doesn't it? Absolutely right.
And that's a fair point. I think one's got to be careful when one thinks of what conservatism is to understand what exactly needs to be conserved. Sometimes the process of conservation will mean restoration, reparation, a kind of rehabilitation, and that is to say, sometimes the status quo is the opposite of what we want to conserve. So yes, I take that point, and I think conservatives are also interested in conserving and preserving timeless human institutions, timeless values. I mean, the family would be a very good example. So I think a conservative position on the family today will be skeptical about the quite radical reconfigurations of how we've understood family life. And so in some ways, the conservatives at some junctures will seem to be more like reactionaries, like they're manning the barricades. And that will change from country to country. So for example, in France, conservatism has always had a slightly more counter-revolutionary, reactionary flavour because of the context of the aftermath of 1789. In Germany, I'm not so sure, but I mean, I remember, in Germany in the 1920s, you have this very interesting, sadly very brief chapter of really what kind of the German conservative revival. I'm thinking here of somebody like Ernst Jünger. He's a very, very interesting thinker, and then it gets repudiated, of course, in the 1930s. But each nation has its own way of understanding and thinking about what it is to conserve the nation, and sometimes, yes, that will involve a process of restoration. And I know that talking to a lot of young people on the right today, one of the reasons they're fed up with the Conservatives is they think there's just nothing worth conserving anymore. Everything is being burnt to the ground, and we've got to try and we're engaged first and foremost in a process of restoration. One historical analogy for us here in England would be the restoration of Charles II in the late 1680s after the horrors of the Civil War. And so that process of bringing Charles II back was both, in a way, counter-revolutionary, but it was also one of the most conservative achievements that we've ever seen in England. Yeah.
Would it be fair to describe this movement as hillbillyism in a way? And let me shortly explain what I mean by this. You could disentangle the term hillbilly in saying that it's comprised of two ideas. There's the hill, which might stand for church, family, culturally conservative values, and there's also the billy, which might stand for a rebel soul, rebelling against globalism, rebelling against the all too powerful markets, and against, I guess, war in faraway countries that don't serve the national interest. So would you agree that this might actually come together, both a very conservative, or as you say, restorative strand of politics, but also a kind of revolutionary strand of thinking, in that we need to do away with the thinking of the last 30, 40 years, a globalist strand of thinking?
Yes, I mean, that's an interesting term and an interesting way of unpacking it. I mean, in many ways, I think hillbilly country has lost a lot of those anchoring institutions like church, like family, like local community, in ways that, for most of those communities, there is no hill anymore. It's just a flat, deindustrialized wasteland. And for many of them, if you look at the fentanyl, the opioid crisis, you look at the economic consequences of deindustrialization, church-going is plummeting. That old sort of evangelical culture that kept a lot of those parts of the country going, that has been rapidly eroded. So there is this deep sense of economic dispossession. Very few people who can articulate it to, and I think that is what Vance is so good at. But I think that there is something to that. I suppose my question to you would be, to what extent does hillbillyism diverge from Trumpism? I mean, that is in many ways, in 2016, Trump was able to crystallize and articulate a lot of those concerns. I mean, that really is the sort of, those concerns are part of the DNA of the MAGA movement. And
well,
I think
you could say his tariff policies are new.
Yes, although he's been talking about tariffs.
This is the most anti-globalist policy that he has enacted so far.
Well, yes and no, depending on how one understands the intent behind the tariff policies. It could be that it's actually pushing for greater globalization if you buy the line that the tariffs are a negotiating tool to create freer markets and freer trade agreements. And there's some evidence that that's already happening. I think, yes, there's a sort of an emerging economic consensus on the right, which separates it from the old GOP orthodoxies, that says we've got to be more, maybe lean more left and on economics, and that the state needs to be more muscular and interventionist. And that's definitely part of Vanceism. You think of something like Orrin Cass's work on this, and there's many others in those circles that would see tariffs as a way of trying to trying to reverse the deindustrialization that created so much that great sense of dispossession among the hillbillies.
Right. Could you try and help us understand JD Vance's image of Europe? You sometimes wonder if he loathes or if he loves Europe, or maybe both is the case to a certain extent. But you know, let us look back at the speech he gave at Munich, which shocked so many people. I guess you watched it too. What did you think when you saw and heard the speech?
Well, I noted earlier that, you know, not only can you not hate FIFA and love football, you can actually hate FIFA because you love football. You don't like what FIFA is doing to football. And I think the way to understand the sort of Vance speech in Munich is to say, it's not that he hates Europe, it's that he loves Europe. And he sees an out-of-touch, autocratic, technocratic, increasingly unaccountable European elite that is not responsive to the needs and the desires of its electorate. And he sees that disconnect and he feels for Europe because he loves Europe and he doesn't like what he thinks is happening to it, whether it's on free speech, freedom of association, whether it's on policies that have led to rapid demographic change that have benefited some parts of society, but not those parts of society that the left purports to champion. So I think that's the way to kind of get a grip on, you know, what was animating that speech. It was not at all Europhobia or hostility to Europe. It was, as it were, criticism and hostility, if anything, towards an out-of-touch technocratic elite that doesn't celebrate what is distinctive about Europe, doesn't celebrate in particular the values that Americans believe they share with Europe. And so I think that's the way to understand it. I think it's too easy and too simplistic, as I think much of the media did, was to say, you know, this is just America first, Europe last. That's not the way they think. It's certainly not the way Vance thinks things. He looks across to Britain, he looks across to Europe and thinks, this is where America came from, and we hate to see it lose sight of the values that made those great countries what they were.
He visited you here in your home last year. Did you discuss these issues?
Goodness, I can't remember. We didn't talk. We don't normally talk politics very much.
What else do you talk?
We talk about all sorts of different things. Well, we talk about our families. We talk about our careers. Talk what we're reading. We talk about religion. We talk about all kinds of things. And yeah, I think we talk about our nations. He's always very interested in what's going on here in Britain. He's very interested in the challenges that the right is facing. He's very interested in, and I think, you know, probably saddened by the failure of politicians to deliver after Brexit. I mean, you mentioned earlier that, you know, the somewheres are taking control, and in many ways, that's not at all what's happened. I mean, there was a sense that the people that the somewheres have sort of won through, had sort of expressed this extraordinary kind of cri de coeur in 2016, but there weren't politicians there who were able to deliver it, and I think that's something that concerns a lot of Americans.
Right. What is your impression? How well does JD Vance really know Europe? Because take the example of the Munich speech. He might be right in principle there, that Europe has a problem with free speech. Even The Economist has been admitting this recently. At the same time, when you look at the details, you wonder, goodness, what newspapers does he even read? Also, if you want to make the point that you really love Europe and you're concerned about Europe, this may not have been the smartest way to convey this message at the Munich Security Conference. And this also might show that he might be concerned for Europe, but maybe he doesn't have the right literacy of Europe and for Europe.
Well, as I recall, I mean, the example that he cited most emphatically in that speech was the example of Adam Smith O'Connor, a man who was praying silently outside an abortion clinic here in England and was arrested for breaching a buffer zone. And that case is not a one-off, I can tell you, because I've been watching.
He was not only doing this. He was not only praying there. He was basically protesting because he stood there for hours.
Well,
he had a conflict with police. He wouldn't go away. It was not just about praying.
It's, you know, I think to an American brought up on the First Amendment,
sure,
this is something that
Sure.
that is shocking.
But
And
you have to see the context.
Well, of course you have to. Look, he broke the law. I'm not saying he didn't break the law. The question is, why were those laws? Why are those laws in place? Why is legitimate protest
That's a good question
and
to ask.
silent thought a criminal offense?
That's a very good question to ask. And still, JD Vance misrepresented what actually happened at this abortion clinic.
Listen, he was absolutely correct to identify a case that perfectly encapsulated, certainly for many of us Brits, a free speech crisis in this country. There's absolutely no question that we are, 30 people a week are being approached, charged, arrested, I can't remember the exact details, for online speech offences. This is something which, there was the abortion clinic cases as well. And there's a sense that the law is being applied selectively. There's a young woman who tweeted something appalling last summer. She deleted it.
After the Southport murders.
Around the Southport unrest. This is this unrest in the UK last year. The Court of Appeal has just refused to reduce what was, I think, by any account, a wildly disproportionate
sentence.
She's
been put in jail for 31 months for a tweet.
For a tweet, in effect. And so I think, it's easy to sort of go through on a case-by-case now, did he get that detail right? Did he get this detail right? But I don't think there's any real doubt on either the left or the right that the culture of free speech and that sort of culture of freedom that liberalism founds itself upon, it's in its DNA. Liberals, first and foremost, want to champion freedom. And I don't think, on any measure that free speech and that pursuit of freedom is what it was. And I think if you look at the other part of the Munich speech, it's also, what is it that's kind of structurally connected to the policing of speech and to nervousness around saying certain things?
Sure.
Mass migration and rapid demographic change and diversity. Diversity, not only is diversity not our strength, it is a challenge, it is a weakness, where you have a society that you're trying to maintain as a cohesive, flourishing political community, where you've got effectively different emerging demographics with wildly different understandings of very basic fundamental ways of life. And whether you think some are wrong, some are right, that creates an enormous challenge. And what it means, I think, for good and perhaps sincere motivations, the state is beginning to police the borders of acceptable speech and the parameters of what's in ways that you, in ways, by the way, that you can, it's easy to blame the state for being kind of tyrannical and authoritarian.
Oh, there's more behind this than the state.
But actually, you can understand why, for example, security services here in this country are absolutely terrified about the threat of civil unrest, particularly among certain parts of our national community.
I think what is behind all this is an immigration society which has become afraid of itself.
Absolutely.
They're anxious to cause community tensions when you stick to your free speech principles. That's the problem.
I think that's right. I think, and it makes sense when you're in a you're in a culture. If you're Sweden in 1990, you've got 9 million Swedes. You might have a few, tens of thousands of people who are not Swedish and who don't share Swedish values, but that doesn't matter. You can accommodate that. You can integrate those differences very easily, and therefore you can have a culture of free speech and free association and protest and a vigorous press and so on, without really it presenting any existential threat to the sort of unity and solidarity of your community.
Sure, but if you are concerned about all of this, if you want to address these issues, and if you want to advocate more freedom of expression, free speech, do you think that the German AfD is your right ally in this? Because Vance not only, criticized the fact that there is this firewall between the AfD in Germany and the other parties. He also basically said, tear down this firewall.
Right.
But and I wonder, does he really know what party he's talking about here?
I don't know. I've never spoken with him about the AfD, and I think the AfD's successes in the was it the state elections at the end of last year. Yes. I haven't spoken to him about any of that since then. I don't know. I mean, you're the German expert. I don't know much about German politics, and I don't know whether his intervention there was wise or not. I think his concerns were, if I recall, that is it German courts looking to get permission for surveillance of certain AfD politicians, I think. And look, I just don't know what the basis. I don't know what the basis for that is.
Right.
If it doesn't look good from where I'm standing. Maybe there are good reasons for it. I just don't know. I'm not. I haven't got the facts at my fingertips. But I suspect he wouldn't have intervened if he hadn't been. If there hadn't been people in the State Department saying, "Look, this is an issue. This is a concern." I mean, I think he also commented on the issue around Georgescu. Was it in Romania? Again, probably not a politician. I would be very supportive of, but probably he wouldn't be very supportive of. But I think it's not so much about the politics of the particular parties or the particular politicians. It's just this sense that in the kind of these cradles of liberal democracy is just hitting these buffers. That yes, there may be parties we don't like very much.
I get that,
but why are they being?
You can't disentangle the politics of the parties from exactly this question, because maybe also parties like the AfD are buffering the freedoms that we all want.
Well, that's I don't know. I just don't know enough about the AfD. I mean, I think parties should be free within the law to advocate policies that people might want, and sure. Look, could there be a case where a political party is advocating for something that is just so flagrantly anti-constitutional that we would have to put limits, we would have to put some kind of constraints on them? But again, either a democracy is a liberal democracy or it's an illiberal democracy, and if a democracy is genuinely committed to freedom, then it should be committed to allowing political parties, political movements, even those we would find very distasteful, from, as it were, offering a policy platform to the electorate and trusting the people and letting the people decide. If you're not allowing the demos to have its say, then all you've got is Kratos.
Right, but there is this German trauma about Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was elected as well. And then again, we have politicians within the AfD, and I'm not saying that is representative for all of the AfD, but there are leading politicians in the AfD, like Björn Höcke in the East, who clearly employs Nazi language. He warns of a Volkstod, of an ethnic death of the Germans. Or he has dubbed the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin as a monument of shame. He has also said that he doesn't not only wish for a 1,000-year history, but a 1,000-year future for Germany, which is a clear reference to the 1,000-year Reich of the Nazis. So, I mean, would you not say that, yes, democracy should principally allow for all parties to have the same chance, but there might be extremists who should at least be called as such?
Well, look, again, I can't really comment on, I've not heard of the gentleman you refer to, and I've not come across that rhetoric before. And I mean, I can imagine it's deeply unsettling for a German voter. And I suspect most German voters would express that feeling of unease at the ballot box. I mean, it makes us uncomfortable, but what alternative is being proposed here? Should there be laws in Germany, restricting what certain people running for parliament, running for election, are allowed to say with respect to that traumatic period in Germany's history back in 80 years ago now? Again, what would those laws look like? Who's in charge of enforcing them? Right. Now, in many ways,
the only thing I'm trying to say here is that if you endorse the AfD as American vice president, you should be aware of what I just quoted, for instance.
Well, look, that's a matter for him. Look, he doesn't need me to defend him. I'm not his spokesman. I'm not his policy advisor, and I can't remember the exact details of the intervention. I mean, from what I remember, is he's concerned about the firewall. I don't know if he's actually endorsing that party, endorsing all of its policies. I think he's simply saying, I think he wanted to send a signal that a political party with, as I understand it, significant support in the German electorate, particularly in the East, should not be censored. And it may be a party that makes us uncomfortable. The rhetoric might make us uncomfortable. The policies might make us uncomfortable. But again, if we are really serious about liberal democracy, we shouldn't be we shouldn't be, as it were, turning into an illiberal democracy, and we shouldn't be separating the kratos from the demos. We shouldn't be separating power from the people.
Right. Could we talk about another, let's say, encounter that was between JD Vance and Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office? Mm-hmm. And I would like to return to this because I think it is important in a certain way. When I watched this, I thought, wow, this is a person, JD Vance, who clearly feels humiliated. And I wonder if what this scene showed was one person who felt humiliated passing on his humiliation to another person, in this case, Volodymyr Zelensky. Mm-hmm. What do you make of this reading?
I think that probably over-psychologizes what was happening in that room. I think the way to understand the Oval Office is he cares about the nation, he cares about the American people, and in particular, he's very skeptical of the forever warmongering of his predecessors in the GOP and of the Democrat Party, of what I think of as the uni party over the last 20 years, which I think he rightly sees have been a disaster. And so, maybe some of that frustration was coming out. Mm-hmm. I mean, to his credit, he has been a consistent and pretty courageous critic of, unaudited and fairly sort of uncosted transfers of money and support to Ukraine since he appeared in the Senate, and that's been, he's been pretty much on his own there very much on his own there within the GOP, and being such a sort of forceful critic of extending American support for Ukraine in that war without any clear end goal, without any clear understanding of how that support was being received and deployed on the battlefield, worries about corruption and so on and so forth. And I don't think those are unreasonable concerns. And that Oval Office incident, it's easy to just dwell on the last few minutes there where, tempers became frayed. But I think, it's generally that hour was, the hour beforehand, it was a fairly amiable conversation. And I think, very often those conversations, are happening in corridors of power all across the world, but behind closed doors. I think what was incautious about that was having that kind of a press conference that was long and rambling, where voices were raised and things were said that might have been regretted later. And it would have been better to have it behind closed doors. But I think that the intention behind that meeting was a positive one. The agreement was ready to sign, the idea was that this is the pathway for Ukraine to get to peace and prosperity. And yes, it will mean, unfortunately, concessions to the malevolent Putin in the East. But this is that they went into that meeting thinking, this is what we want to do. This is what we will vote. This is what the American people.
The whole thing was spoiled, and the nerves.
And so there was a sense of frustration that Zelensky was not in that meeting, which I think is true, and one can completely understand it from Zelensky's point of view.
Yeah. The reason why I'm dwelling so much on the idea of humiliation or a humiliated nation, if you like, is that it might help explain some of the policies of Vance Trump at the moment. And if you say that what they really want to achieve is to restore liberal values, the old conservative America in a way, the nation state. It appears to me that there's more behind this than just this. And humiliation might help explain why it is not just about, for instance, rebalancing viewpoint diversity at universities or taking control of the borders again and immigration. But to me, there appears to be an element of revenge in all this. Like, wanting to crush the lefties, punishing them for what they have done to us in the past. Do you think there is an element to this?
I don't think so. I mean, I think they look at the elite universities and they see the extraordinary asymmetries in political affiliation, which are real and undeniable, particularly in the Ivy Leagues. and they see the extent to which those universities dominate the coastal elites and form the opinions of a coastal elite that is increasingly out of touch with mainstream America.
Sure, I'm not denying the problem. My question is, if they, trying to correct this, they are pouring out the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah, I think there may well be some truth to that. I mean, look at in the case of the universities, or whether it's the southern border, or whether it's DEI in the federal administration, or whether it's government waste. All of these issues are issues that they were very open about on the campaign trail. I mean, over and over and over, and it's quite the same with tariffs as well. And so, and then when they get into power, they actually start doing something about it. And I think that's surprising to many, certainly many British politicians. There's that old phrase that, you campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. Which is a sort of politician's shorthand for saying, we make all these promises on the campaign trail, but we're not actually going to deliver them. And I think part of the shock has been, well, yes, they said they do all of these things, and now they're actually doing them. But I take your point, it's certainly when you're trying to, if you look at the last sort of 120 days, in some areas, they've moved very fast, very drastically, and extremely effectively. So they've effectively solved the southern border crisis, a crisis that 6 months ago we were being assured was, Biden was assuring us was completely, the Americans was completely unsolvable.
But let me ask you this again, do you think there is an element of cultural revenge in this?
Well, I don't doubt that there probably is a sense of anger at the alienation and the kind of cultural dispossession that many within the MAGA movement, within the flyover states, within the economically and socially marginalized classes have felt, and perhaps it's, I think, from the Trump-Vance point of view, it's a righteous anger. Could that metastasize into sort of ugly forms of just vindictiveness for the sake of it? Yes, no doubt. And I think certainly in some of Trump's rhetoric there is that sort of pettiness, that sense of cruelty. That one's in his sort of personal interactions, and I'm sure that there are elements of that there. But I think the thing is, in politics, vindictiveness is everywhere. Everybody is driven by these sort of deep visceral impulses. Some people are better at covering it up than others. Sure. And I think one of the things about Trump, you look at him, and particularly from this side of the Atlantic, you just think this guy, he's an oaf. There's something overbearing about him. There's something so sort of rough around the edges about him. But I think a lot of American voters, clearly, judging by the results last November, look at him and think, yeah, but we like him. He's human. We can. What we see is what we get. Yeah. And maybe there's something a dynamic there.
I mean, many Germans like to refer what they are seeing now back to the 1930s when fascism rose in Germany. Yes. I'm not buying into this analogy. I'd like to present you another one, which is a bit earlier, 100 years ago, when Germany lost the First World War and was presented the Treaty of Versailles. There was this feeling of humiliation and, being stabbed in the back by not only the lefties in Germany at the time, but also by an international elite that wanted to put down Germany, that wanted it to never blossom again. And then what happened was that the conservatives at the time, the generals and the aristocracy at the time, they wanted to restore what they regarded as Germany's deserved glory. And I feel very much reminded of those days today when I look at America than of fascism.
Yes, these historical precedents and analogies can be quite helpful. I mean, the idea that that the correct way of thinking about America now is something like the way Germany was after the First World War that's a difficult parallel to draw. I mean, America is very far away from the Weimar Republic and the sort of chaos of those years. I'm not sure. I don't think there is that sense. What would be the equivalent to the Treaty of Versailles? Maybe you would say, the Paris Treaty on climate change. You might say, what did Trump do? He said, well, we're just pulling out of it. And
the WTO regulations, the fact that China became a member of the WTO, sorry,
in 2001. Look, I think there are,
and never abided by the rules.
Well, that's absolutely right. And there are many economists on both sides of that argument as to whether it was a good idea for Clinton to admit China into the WTO.
Yeah.
In my sense, there is an emerging consensus that not that they should have necessarily, China should have been kept out of the WTO, but its admission into the WTO should have been on much more stringent conditions. And I don't think there's any argument really on left or right that China has exploited its status within the WTO. And America is simply saying, it has exploited them unfairly, and we're going to take measures to resist this. And is that in the interests of the world? Well, let's see. I think when all is said and done, I would much rather a Pax Americana than a Pax Sinaitica.
Right. Could we just, before we finish, for the last couple of minutes, come back to your own beliefs and your idea of national conservatism? I couldn't help but notice when we entered your beautiful home, there is an inscription above the door. And if you don't mind, I would like to read it.
Of course.
It's from the Bible, from Revelation 22, verse 2, and it reads, "And the leaves of the trees are for the healing of the nations." What does this sentence mean to you?
Well, I'd love to take credit for that, but you would have to ask my wife. My wife is a vicar in the Church of England, and her father was a bishop. She grew up in the church. It's the family business. And when we came here to our home here in Cambridge, there are trees everywhere. And for her, it was a sort of an image of hope. And I think actually, if you look at that verse in Revelation, it's for the healing of the nations. So, 2 points there. I think what the author of Revelation is implying there is that, the way we should be organizing ourselves in political communities should be going with the grain of nature, not against it. And that somehow the flourishing of nature should be something that political communities, human communities should be conforming to, not cutting against. And the healing of the nations, ta ethne in Greek, and that's the Greek of the Revelation, I think, of the book of Revelation in that verse. Ta ethne in Greek, in New Testament Greek, means simply the nations. Now, it doesn't quite mean the nation states, but there's a recognition in Scripture, in Plato, in Aristotle, and throughout the whole classical canon, that there are these, as it were, that human beings organize themselves into independent communities, and that's fine. And that we should be seeking the flourishing of all communities, and that we should be seeking, as it were, the flourishing of the family of all communities, but not in a way that homogenizes them into one sort of bland blob controlled by a supracommunal power, coercive power that is unaccountable to individual members of the communities.
Well, I have to ask now, do you see Muslim immigration as a threat to this idea of nation that you just described?
Well, it's true that, Islam has a very different understanding of both the nation state and secular neutrality from Christian and post-Christian nations. Christianity is unusual, and this goes back to Augustine, in creating this distinction between the eternal and the temporal, or at least which has become this distinction between the ecclesiastical or the spiritual and then the neutral, procedural, secular public square. And Islam has never, for reasons you can entirely understand, if you're a monotheist, how could you have some neutral space that God is not, doesn't have control over? So in a way, Islam's political theology is much more consistent in erring more towards what you might say, the theocratic. Now, it will depend whether you're in Sunni Islam, of course, or Shia Islam. What I would say is that, a lot of the debate around Islam I find in the West to be, it is not very fine-grained. And, there is a broad spectrum of opinion, obviously, within Islam. I don't like this very new distinction between Islam and Islamism, because, I think it doesn't do, it doesn't reckon with the way in which Islamists are, appealing to authoritative sources in theologically coherent ways that we need to make sense of.
So one thing. Try to rephrase this.
Yes.
So what troubles you is that the separation between worldly law and divine law has not been thoroughly sought after in Islam.
I'm not saying it troubles me. I mean, I wouldn't want to say that. In fact, what I'm saying is that Islam is actually much more consistent in in finding it odd that a monotheistic tradition like Christianity, as it were, has given birth to a theologically neutral secular space. I'm saying that is an unusual. That's an unusual outcome, you might say, for any monotheistic political theology. Now, it is also in many ways the secret source of the West. It's what has given birth to secular liberal democracy, and it's what's allowed us, as it were, to have a fundamentally pluralist liberal public square. I think the worry is that that there are parts of Islam that mass migration into Europe and all across Europe involves millions of people who, well, we don't entirely understand what their background is. It's often very hard to sort of identify. Often they'll come from very, very troubled, war-torn parts of the world, and will understandably carry on a lot of those practices and a lot of that sense of communal kind of fragility and anger and resentment, which was part of the world in which they found themselves. So, does it present an existential threat? I mean, I think the question I'm more interested in is, why has the West lost its sense of what's existentially significant? Why has the West lost its sense of what it is? Why is it so ashamed of itself? Why is it so often that intellectuals in the West want to repudiate the past in a way that is not true of Islam? In Islam, there's a civilizational confidence, there's a civilizational pride in what they are. And you can imagine if you're,
maybe part of the answer is that Christianity preaches that you have to side with the underdog to be morally distinctive.
Yes, well, I think that's a subtle point, and this, of course, is Nietzsche's great critique of Christianity. It's to some extent Oswald Spengler's critique of Christianity, that this is a philosophy of the underdog. It valorizes victimhood.
Not necessarily of the underdog, but for the underdog. So
it's for the underdog, and so and it's for the victim. And it's for a kind of fake idea of human equality. That's the sort of that's the criticism. Yes, I mean, I think it's even though most European nations now are, I would say, in a kind of more post-Christian than they are Christian. To be a post-Christian country is very, very different from being, say, a post-Islamic country or a post-Buddhist country. And so there's no. It's I think it's very plausible that we've inherited a lot of the moral reflexes and impulses and instincts of the religion that we have broadly repudiated, or at least have been within our sort of intellectual elites. And so I think there's a lot of truth to that. And you might say that there's still this sense of maybe sin, secular myths of the fall, but we don't have the mechanisms of emancipation and confession and absolution that institutional religion used to offer us. And that puts us in a very difficult position.
Interesting. Can I ask you, do you have a political home, party-wise?
Here in Britain, well, just for your viewers and listeners, I mean, I'm on the right broadly. I say broadly because a lot of my impulses would be on the left, and a lot of what puts me on the right is my concern at policies that are immiserating the working classes here in Britain.
That would traditionally put you on the left, actually.
Which is why I said broadly on the right. But things are a lot more complicated than they used to be politically, and in many ways that dichotomy of left and right isn't the right prism and lens to understand what's happening in British politics, and indeed across the West for that matter. We were talking earlier about Vance and his sense of championing a dispossessed working class, and yet he's a Republican. He's on the right. Is he? Some people, I think he's very much on the right, too far along the right to the right on the political spectrum. So my political home is the Conservative Party. I would say has betrayed the people. It won this extraordinary election in 2019, the largest majority it had had since 1987, specifically on the promise of recovering a sense of national confidence, specifically on a promise of controlling immigration, controlling our borders, which is something the British electorate has overwhelmingly asked for every time it's being asked.
Right, and then Boris Johnson blew it.
And Boris Johnson blew it. And I think a lot of people on that planet, would probably include me, would find it very difficult ever to vote for the Conservative Party. Again, because what they did was the opposite of conserving the nation. They effectively, if you've got open borders, if there are no sort of lines of demarcation for something, then does that something really exist? And if there are no lines of demarcation at all to a nation, does the nation exist? And how could you claim to be conserving it? So what we're seeing for the first time in British political history is the emergence of a party on the right that is, to go back to our earlier conversation, not seeking to conserve, but to reform and to restore to the point, to the status quo ante that ought to have been conserved. And it's the first time in, 100 years that a party other than the Labour Party and other than the Conservative Party is threatening to break that duopoly that has been in place. So these are exciting times. A lot of people are feeling... The entire
British political landscape is shifting from a two-party system into a more fractured, maybe 3-4 party system.
Yes, it's quite extraordinary.
Could they count on you?
No, I'm very happy here in my day job. I love being at Cambridge, and I think I would be, I very much doubt they'd be calling on me.
All right. Very last question. Would you like your country to be governed by Donald Trump and JD Vance?
I love my country. What I love about my country is that it's British, and I would not want anyone other than British people to be in charge of Britain. I was a passionate Brexiteer. I'm thrilled that we've, at least until Starmer started giving it back, but regained our political sovereignty from Brussels. I do not want our cultural sovereignty, and certainly I don't want our political sovereignty being surrendered to Washington DC or Silicon Valley or Manhattan or Harvard University. So no, I would not want us to be the 51st state or the 52nd or 53rd state. It's hard to keep. Yeah. Yes, I mean, in my view, is we should be making America Great Britain again. That would be the ideal.
On that happy note, Dr. James Orr, thank you so much.
Thank you.